opportunity because it really is the focus of the whole quarter. And I think we can pretty well at least touch on the book in some way as a whole. You know, this survey is designed to give us the big picture of the Bible. So, you know, by design, if you're going to cover the whole Bible in 3.5 years, you're really not going to be able to study Isaiah verse by verse. It's worth studying verse by verse, and there ought to be outlets to do that. But our class is more big picture. But we do have 26 classes to cover the 50 chapters, about 2 chapters roughly. On average, a class will allow us at least to touch on the material. That'll be our goal. So as you know, I trust, I hope that this is an opportunity that we'll take advantage of. And that in preparing for these classes, looking at the book as a whole, reading through it, be wonderful. But also in a concentrated way to think about a couple of chapters at a time. That's the way. How do you prepare for this class? That's the way to do it. Read the book and then read a couple of chapters with particular interest about questions that you may have. Bring those up. If we can, we'll try to answer them. If not, we'll try to help find some answers. Just as a point of order, the last class for this quarter will be, Lord willing, the 2nd of July. So if you're teaching next quarter, that'll be a date to remember. The next quarter will begin on the 6th of July, an auspicious date. So we'll look at it that way. You've already had plenty of good introduction. The one thing that I would say, maybe a couple of points that I might just quickly reiterate. Number one, when you think about the book of Genesis, one of the unique things about Genesis is that when you look at the Bible, for example, as a timeline, right? You know, how much time does the book cover? I think Don's made this point. But, you have maybe 4,000 years of history in the Bible. I believe that to be true. But, when you look at individual books, here's the book of Exodus, for example. It covers about 80 years, 81 years. The book of Leviticus would cover maybe a month. The book of Acts would cover 30 years. The book of Genesis would cover 2,400 years of history. You think about that. Well, obviously, he's not going to try to be exhaustive in the history. But it covers, if you look at it as a timeline, Genesis just dominates the scene, doesn't it? So that's an interesting thing about Genesis. But also, one way, and there are many ways to outline Genesis, but one common way to outline it is to think about it in terms of God's focus. And the first 11 chapters of Genesis, as we divide the book into chapters and verses, you have this idea of the early history of man. But relatively quickly, doesn't it? After all that's going on, God focuses on one man, Abraham, and his family, Isaac, and then Jacob. So one way to outline Genesis is chapters 1 through 11, early history of man, 12 through 50, the family of Abraham and the story of redemption. That's why, of course, because it was to Abraham God made the great promise to redeem the world. And so that's why God quickly focuses not on what was going on in China, what was going on. He's focusing on the story of redemption. That's the story of the Scriptures. And that's why I think Genesis is given to us as it is. Let me mention one more thing quickly. And this is something that I hope to do this time. And to tried it in the past, but I'm going to try to do a better job this time. What I would like to do, and I'd like to challenge you with this, as we go through Genesis in these chapters, and by the way, don't you find it helpful if you just try to start anew? I mean, we certainly have learned things about it. But every time we go through this series, every time we go through this review, I think it's a great thing just to start anew in that regard. So with that in mind, we'd like to go through the book of Genesis and make it our personal goal. Again, God didn't give us chapters as we have here, but let's try to make it our goal to summarize, to have one letter, one sentence to summarize each of the chapters of Genesis, so that at the end of this we can try to be able to recall the theme of every chapter in Genesis. That's a goal that I think as adult Bible students would be a worthy goal. And one that if we can commit that to memory, well, we'll have a good handle on this book, won't we? We may not be able to answer every question, but we can say, well, I'm a student of Genesis. So let's just make that our goal, if you will, this quarter. Okay. Let's look at Genesis chapter 1 and verse 1. In the beginning, this is the old translation, in the beginning, God created the heaven and the earth was without form and void, and darkness was upon the face of the deep. And the Spirit of God moved upon the face of the waters. And God said, let there be light. And there was light. And God saw the light, that it was good. And God divided the light from the darkness, and God called the light day, and the darkness He called night, and the evening and the morning were the first day. I said earlier that, if you cover 2 chapters of Genesis, a class, you can get through the books. But you know, because you've read this book before, boy, it's pretty dense here at the beginning, isn't it? You could spend 2 months on the first 2 chapters, I think, of Genesis. So we'll be tempted to do that. We'll probably do a little more here than we will in some chapters. But it's a marvelous beginning of the story. That's what the name Genesis means, doesn't it? It means beginning. It's the beginning of the Bible. It's the beginning of so many things. This great story that God gives to us through Moses. One of the things you notice here in verse 1, in the beginning God created the heaven and the earth. And that's a fantastic sentence. I slept through at least a couple of physics classes. But as I recall, when it comes to physics and they talk about the elements of the universe, what do they talk about? They're about time, matter, energy, space. And that's, has been pointed out before, that's really what you find here, isn't it? In the beginning, time, God created energy, the heaven, space. And we'll talk more about that word heaven in just a minute. And the earth, matter. And so the elements of the physical universe are created by God. And here they are from the beginning. Time, space, matter, energy. But notice this too, and this is a key point, that before the beginning, this is not the beginning of everything, because before the beginning, there was God. There was God. You'll meet folks, intelligent people today, who will think they've got a great question. Who made God? If God made it, who made God? But logically, there has to be a creator. There has to be a first cause. Unless you believe in eternal matter, which is has all kind of problems, then you have to believe that there was before what was made, there is a first cause. God is that first cause. And so it's God who created the heaven and the earth. We'll say more about that also in just a second. How did He create it? Well, if you look in the Psalms, the Bible talks a lot about creation in other places besides Genesis. It was just a few years ago, I made a concentrated study of Job. I'd read that book before. But I think you can make a case that we might find more about creation in Job than we do in Genesis. There's a great deal about in Job. But here in Genesis, we find God created. And the Psalms write about that very point. Psalm 33 and verse 6 reads, "The Lord created the heavens by His command, the sun, the moon, the stars, by His spoken word. He gathered all the seas into one place. He shut up the ocean depths in storerooms. Worship the Lord, all the earth. Honor Him, all the peoples of the world. When He spoke, the world was created. At His command, everything appeared." I just cannot help but let that passage inform me when you read those words, God created. He spoke it into existence. Light be, and light was. God said, let it be, and so it was. This was not a great strain on Him. And it wasn't a process that took place, we'll not take time with this, but there are people, there have been religious writers through the years, and especially in the 20th century, 21st century, who believe that there's a great gap of time between verse 1 and verse 2, for example. That God might have created the earth and the heavens, but then millions of years, billions maybe, of time passed, and then the story in verse 2 picks up. There's nothing of that effect that you read about in the Scripture. The idea is that God spoke and the universe came into existence, the heaven and the earth. Have a question or a point? Yes?
Well, two things on that. You think the only thing I can make when I speak a little bit of noise is from carbon dioxide,
Right.
That's one. It's not much effort for me to spout, whatever nonsense, and that's the effort that it took God to create everything.
Yeah.
And, build beds for the kids before I made things, but man, it takes a lot of effort for me to do the smallest of things like that.
Yeah.
It's a lot. It was nothing for God to make everything. It's amazing in that depth. And I've said before, I've said it a dozen times, we'll get into it, where God made Adam. It doesn't say God made Adam as a baby and watched him grow and taught him to do all that. God made Adam knowing to walk and talk and do all of these things. God doesn't have to make a 4 billion or whatever it is year old place to make a place that has, as far as the physical laws of the world, has existed for that long, because he made it all at the same time.
Right.
The closest thing I can liken it to is an author, and they write a book about a character, and they fill in the details around it. God made the earth, and he filled in the details of the universe around it.
Yeah.
Now, in your story, your character might not be the first character that's ever born in the universe, but they were the one you created first. But to make the laws and make everything the way you want it to make sense, you write in the rest of it. But still, what did you make first? What was first in the way that it was? That's the closest way I have to making it make sense in my head. How correct it might not be the greatest, but it makes much more sense than everything just appearing out of nothing.
Yeah. Yes, sir.
Moses believed he made it 6 days in Exodus 20.
Yeah, no question. Yeah.
He didn't seem
Yes, sir. That's right. We'll talk about the days in just a second. That's right. Yes, ma'am.
I was curious if you could talk a minute about him saying there was evening and morning the first day. Like in my mind, I think morning and night, not evening and morning. So do you have any thoughts about why evening was first?
Yeah. No, I don't know. I know that the Jews would have counted it that way as well at the beginning. Yeah, their Sabbath started in the evening. So, that was something that they did continue there. I don't know that I have a great answer to that, other than the fact that I think evening and morning made a day. And I do think, as has been suggested already, that still constitutes a day, however we might count the time. But that's a great question. I'll try to give some more thought to that. Let me say just a word about this verse 1 here, when he talks about God creating earth and heaven. First of all, earth was different, wasn't it? We think about the big blue ball and the beauty of the light. But what was the earth like, according to verse 2? There was earth, but it was different. Without form. I think suggesting the idea of its barrenness. It was a barren place. There was no life there, obviously. What else do we know about that from verse 2? Darkness. What did darkness cover? Everything, the face of the deep. It was a water-covered planet, wasn't it? It seems water. Barren, dark, void, empty. And then the Spirit of God moved. Does your translation say moved in verse 2? Hovered? Yeah. The word is used, I think, at least one of the time. It's over in, where is it? In Deuteronomy, isn't it? Deuteronomy, where it talks about a great bird, an eagle, maybe fluttering over its nest. Some of you guys raise livestock, raise birds. You have seen that before, about a bird brooding. And so the idea here is that God created the heaven and the earth. The earth was void, dark, lifeless. But then the Spirit of God moved upon the face of the waters. At some point, we ought to make the point, I'm sure you've heard before, that you really see here, in the very beginning words of the Bible, an image of the nature of God and how that God has three personalities, Father, Son, and Spirit, that are all in that category of God. We see the Spirit of God here involved. But we remember from other passages, for example, in John chapter 1, in the beginning was the Word. John begins his gospel, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. The same was in the beginning with God. All things were made by Him, and without Him was not anything made that was made. And so, because we're students of the New Testament, we realize that all those passages that talk about creation always include Jesus with it, the Word that was with God and was God. Paul in Colossians chapter 1 likewise points out, speaking of Jesus in Colossians 1 and verse 16, by Him were all things created that are in heaven and that are in earth, visible and invisible, whether they be thrones, dominions, principalities, powers. All things were created by Him and for Him, and He is before all things, and by Him all things consist. All things were made by Him. There's another passage that comes to mind, Hebrews chapter 1, I believe it is, chapter 1, Hebrews 1 and verse 1, God who at sundry times and in divers manners spake in time past to the fathers by the prophets, hath in these last days spoken to us by His Son. Notice, by whom also He made the world. You can't separate the Father from creation. But how many times do we read in the Scriptures that it was through, by the Son, that these things were made? So Father, Son, and Spirit. You've heard before that the word here back in Genesis 1:1, God, and repeatedly, is Elohim. I don't know anything about Hebrew, but I do know from those who do that that's a plural form of the word. It's not translated gods, and it should not be. And people have suggested, well, that just says, or it's used as a sort of a majestic plural, and that may be true. But it also fits very well what we read here. And that is, we have the Father and the Son and the Spirit working together in reference to creation. And I just think that's a point to make as we pass through. God made the earth. He also made heaven. Let's say a word about that too, if we may. What does He mean by heaven? This word, Shemayim, is used, I think, in different ways. Sometimes it's used in reference to the dwelling place of God. I can remember years ago having a discussion with a fellow, an old Presbyterian preacher that was trying to teach me something about Greek. I never did learn much. But anyway, he made the point from Genesis 1, how we got over there now, that when God made the heaven and the earth, He thought that was talking about God's dwelling place. He didn't believe God was created, but God's dwelling place was created. Okay, well, if I grant that to be so, I never have felt like it was in this passage. Because it seems to me that what he's talking about here has to do with the material universe, and I don't think heaven's material. But it's an interesting thing how Moses uses, or Genesis uses, that word. It is used. You know, Abraham in, is it 24/7, I think? Abraham does talk about God as being the God who dwells in heaven. That's not a material place there. But here, even in our context, it's used, in chapter 1 and verse 14, let there be lights in the firmament of the heaven. You know, we think about space, and I think that's the reference sometimes. Heaven is used that way. Same word, but a different application. Because God doesn't dwell somewhere between here and Mars. He is in one sense everywhere, but that's not what the Bible talks about, His dwelling place. It's also used, I think, of something closer to us. For example, in Genesis 1 and verse 8, God called the firmament, we'll get to that in just a minute, heaven. And the evening and the morning were the second day. And so the atmosphere, if you will, where the birds dwell. Verse 20, he made the fowl of the air to fly in the firmament of heaven. So it's a word that's used more than one way. I think when God made the heaven and the earth, I think what he's talking about in this context would be the idea of space itself. In fact, I think one of the modern translations I checked translates this word here, universe. God made the universe, the earth. And I don't know if that's a great translation, but I do think that's probably the thought here. God made space, a place in which to put the rest of his creation. So, God created the heaven and the earth. And then, of course, famously, in verse 3, God said, let there be light. And I try in my mind to picture this scene, and I struggle because I'm limited, about a realm that God creates that has never known anything but darkness, and then light is introduced. And how glorious that must have been. What kind of light was it? I don't know all the logistics of how this worked, but it's a dramatic picture, isn't it? Light be, and light was, for the first time, light in this new realm that God has made. And what did he say about that, by the way? What did he say about the light? Pardon? Good. It was good. That's right. And you notice, I know you have, you've been through this book a number of times, but notice how many times God says that, over and again. It was good, it was good, it was good. Until 1:31. After he's finished, what does he say? It was very good. And I think if I understand it, what that phrase suggests is that it was exactly what he wanted. Doesn't surprise us that God would do it just right. But, you know, everything he made was exactly according to his purpose. It was very good. And so they were evening and morning, one day. One day. Another thing that you may hear sometimes, this is really big on what we might call TikTok religion. You know, you'll watch on those little blurbs, little 15-second or whatever they are, blurb where somebody will get up there and just announce something, pronounce something about the Bible, you know, and it may be just totally without any relevance or fact. But it's a common thought, and has been for a long time before TikTok or whatever, that maybe the days of Genesis are billions of years old. And maybe we ought to think about it that way. Instead of looking at Genesis as a 6-day creation, that maybe what we ought to do is think about this in terms of what a lot of the humanist science philosophy is. That the earth is millions or billions of years old, the universe is billions of years old, and so we'll try to shoehorn that into the Bible. But that really won't work. If you respect the text, I think it's pretty evident that just won't do. As somebody's already pointed out, Rodney, I think pointed out a minute ago, you can find references like, for example, in Deuteronomy 31. And there Moses, this is one place of many, Moses is talking about how Israel needed to keep the Sabbath. And he said it was a sign. And then he said in Exodus 31 and verse 15, 6 days may work be done, but on the 7th is the Sabbath of rest, holy to the Lord. Whoever doeth any work on the Sabbath shall surely be put to death. Verse 17, it is a sign between me and the children of Israel forever, for in 6 days God made the heaven and the earth. And the 7th he rested. And what's the point there? Yeah, that's the point. There's just no evidence to suggest these days. I mean, the word day can be used in different ways. But when Moses points back to this and he applies it to days as he understood it, evening and morning, a day as you and I would know it, that it makes it evident that we're not talking about eons, millions or billions of years, referred to here as a day. So what that says is we believe in a young earth compared to the world. And we won't go into that. There's a lot of good stuff that could be said about that and other fellows who've written about such things. But don't be too moved by or drawn by those who would say that, well, science has proven. Let me tell you, science changes so quickly, make your head spin. And if you just know a little bit, you know that. And the things that people were so certain about 100 years ago, now they would be embarrassed to even admit that was ever written in some scientific journal. So I have every confidence that the Scriptures are right. And I might just make this point quickly too. People will say, well, you know, why would God create the universe in such a fast fashion? Why would He do that? That just seems incredible to me that God could make all this in 6 days. It had to be millions of years or more. And of course, I think we could equally ask the question, why did it take Him so long? Because God could have certainly just, said and it would be all done. He has His reasons why. And I'm sure it's very good why He did it the way He did it. But, to limit God's power and say, well, it just seems like He couldn't do all this in 6 days is to really not understand who God is. Miss Lord, you have a point?
I had a question.
Yes, ma'am.
So I thought about this as I was reading through recently, and the only validity I could think of to put for why somebody would say what they are saying is because the lights that were made for the days and the years and the seasons was created on day 4. So is there any possibility or any explanation that would maybe say that's when the days started? I'm not saying I believe that. I'm just asking the question, trying to understand, like, if days and seasons and years started on day 4, then what was happening 3, 2, and 1?
Yeah. But I think what would answer that would be, He says specifically there was evening and morning one day. So we know that the day started there in the very beginning on day 1. He created, sometimes we will say, we teach our kids, the days of creation. By the way, it's good to know that. And it's good for us to know that. That'd be a goal I think we ought to have if we don't have that handled there. What was made every day? What do we say on day 1? What was made on day 1? Light. And that's not a wrong answer, but it may be incomplete. What else was created on day 1? Heaven. The earth. And I'll tell you something else that was made. The day-night cycle. So in the beginning, God did that. Now, the great question that Miss Lori has hinted at is, how do you have day and night without a sun? And the answer is, He doesn't tell us, but, God, through whatever means that He didn't choose to reveal to us how, created day and night. We can read in Revelation about how that God is going to be the sun. I don't have any idea that'd be too hard for Him, but God created that day-night cycle, evening and morning. Before God created anything else, He created the earth and light and the day-night cycle. And so, but I do think because the text is so specific, it seems to me the text would be clear.
So it wouldn't have changed. Like,
No.
Day-night on day 1 is the exact same as evening and morning on day 4.
Right.
It's just, now we have something in the sky to say.
I think so. I think that would seem to me to be the logical conclusion of the text. And
I don't want anybody to think that I think that there's millions of years.
I thought that was what you were I knew you were thinking that. No, and by the way, I'm not ashamed of people who ask those questions that might believe it or might be confused about it. Questions are not bad. But I do think this is true. And again, I was reading something written by Mike Willis here a while back, and it was, he had some really good work along that line. I didn't bring any quotes from him because there's so much in Genesis that we could get into. We want to try to be judicious about what, but I appreciate the questions. But anyway, his point was, and others have made this point, that, all the ideas that men have that they try to find here are because they believe science, the great infallible source, makes it impossible to believe this story as it's written. And the less confidence you have in the wisdom of men, the less that you feel compelled to do that. So anyway, I think that was probably a decent point. Yes, sir.
I was going to say, I think, so on day 1, the thing that I remember about that is, before there was nothing. And we think of space, I think space being vacuum, but it's not actually completely empty. There's particles dancing around it. There's things. Space has actually an average temperature. You look into all these things. There was no concept at all of light or heat or anything else. I think the concept and actual light, dividing it from the darkness, making there a way to be light and not light, all of that together. And then he said, let me make something where the people can tell the difference later on. The people and the creatures and everything dependent on it can have. But first there was the concept, and then there was something that would continue it for the creatures that he made.
Right. And it's all this foreknowledge of God. There's the big plan here. You know, when I see a construction job going on and I see them digging, I don't know what's, but the fellow who's building knows. He knows what's going to be next and how it's going to look when it's done. Yeah.
The other thing is, people like to say that, well, folks of old didn't understand the world, and so everything they couldn't explain, they attribute to God. But as we get more, as we study more into this, we find the things actually behind it and can reveal what people used to think of God. And it's funny because the people that are actually involved in these things, they keep chasing down more and more of it, and once they've got something figured out, they realize that it only reveals that there's 10 more things that they don't know, and it just keeps going. There's no actual, yet on anything have we found a final, solid, this is exactly how this works thing. Nothing.
Right.
There's lots of theories, there's lots of the math to calculate and prove and do all these things, and just the amount of effort and things it took just to get to the moon, for example, and all those things.
Right.
And still, like you said, as fast as we can come up with it, we find out that that's not the next thing. And I think, for all the controversies of von Braun as a person, one thing that he said, he converted to Christianity late in his life. And one thing he said about it was, the further we go out there, the more I'm convinced of God.
Yeah.
Because the more you find out, the more amazing it all is. It's not, simplistic things.
Yeah. Yeah, this is an amazing story. By the way, not told as a science book. And certainly told from what's a word better than geocentric, but the idea of a word, when God tells us about the creation, it's obviously from the standpoint of man. And so we're not bothered. We expect that. But it is a story that makes sense. And it makes more sense, frankly, than anything else I've ever heard. So we have this picture of the first day. And there's no indication that the day here is any different than day 6 or day 7. It's evening and morning. Now the second day, we also read about in verse 6, and God said, let there be a firmament, the old translation says, in the midst of the waters, let it divide the waters from the waters. And God made the firmament and divided the waters which were under the firmament from the waters which were above the firmament. And it was so. And God called the firmament heaven, and the evening and the morning were the second day. That word firmament. Anybody have another translation besides the word firmament? Expanse. Arch. Vault. Dome. Canopy. And again, it's like that word heaven. It's coupled with it several times. Sometimes it's used, for example, in 1:14 and 15 of the realm of the stars. And sometimes it's used outside of Genesis, in Ezekiel chapter 1, for example, of being the dwelling place of God. And sometimes it's used again of the atmosphere. So it's a pliable word. But I'll share with you what I think he's saying here. I believe he's talking about, think about an archway. This is the space where living things will dwell. You have a water-covered planet, but at some point on day 2, God makes a space so that the waters beneath and the waters above are separated and men can live in this space. I can't live in the clouds, not without some special help. And I can't live underwater. But man is going to have a space when he's created to dwell in. And that's my simple, non-scientific explanation of what the firmament is in this context. Yes?
That's what I was going to say. That's how I understand it. He made the division of where various things would happen. And there's a problem I see, and it's amongst a lot of people, non-religious and religious folks that I've seen a lot. People that believe the earth is flat, that say the firmament's got to be a solid dome. That's what it means. They're trying to dumb something down, I think, because they can't understand it otherwise, and they're coming up with that. But it's not, divisions aren't always solid things.
Right.
Even here in the world, if you think about it, you've got, what's the boundary of the edge of a thunderstorm? It's kind of fluid, isn't it? There's no, there's a spot where the rain maybe starts hitting the ground, but there's an area in front of it where there's a lot of moisture in the air, and the rains, as it condenses, it's just not enough to hit the ground. But there is a place where you're a thunderstorm, there's a place where you're clearly not, and there's a boundary in between the two, even if you're not sure exactly where it is. I think that's what this is. There is a boundary would be, or division would be the best way that I would use more modern language to describe firmament as it's used here.
Look at verse 9. After doing that, God said, let the waters under the heaven be gathered together into one place, and let the dry land appear. And it was so. And God called the dry land earth, and he gathered together the waters, and he called them seas. And God saw that it was good. Let me pause there a second. God is again ordering his creation. He's created this space for men eventually to live and other things. And now he's taking the waters beneath and he's gathering them in one place and drawing the dry land forth. What did that look like? I know how God makes land today. He uses volcanic processes, and I don't know about all that. We can speculate on it. But the idea is that God made dry land appear. And he separated the sea from the land. That's very important because he has a plan and a purpose. But God is getting this all ordered. How noisy was this? That's a whole other question. Those are things interesting to think about, though I don't have all the answers to that. But God made a space. Now God's made the dry land appear. All of this because he knows the plan. And then in verse 11, really significant thing happens here. Not that any of it's insignificant. Because we read about the first life on the earth. What was the first life? And God said, let the earth bring forth grass, the herb yielding seed, the fruit tree yielding fruit after his kind, whose seed is in itself upon the earth. And it was so. And the earth brought forth grass, the herb yielding seed after his kind, the tree yielding fruit, whose seed is in itself after his kind. And God saw that it was good. And again, the evening and the morning were the third day. So, the third day, life appears. And what a variety of life. Again, it's not, as has been suggested already, the idea of there was one seed and from that one seed, but rather the idea of God created life. And then within that life, within that plant life, was the ability to reproduce itself. God was not going to, in a miraculous way, create every plant every time. It was created, full grown, that it might be able to reproduce itself. And don't you find even in that, this marvelous artistry of God? We'll say more about that, I hope, as we go forth. But what a glorious thing. Let me mention one more, if I may, in verse 14 beginning. And God said, let there be lights in the firmament of the heaven to divide the day from the night. And let them be for signs and for seasons and for days and years. And let them be for lights in the firmament of the heaven to give light upon the earth. And it was so. And God made two great lights, the lesser light to rule the day. The greater light to rule the day, the lesser light to rule the night. And He made the stars also. And God set them in the firmament of the heaven. Again, another use of that word. To give light upon the earth, and to rule over the day and over the night, to divide the light from the darkness. And God saw that it was good. And the evening and the morning were the fourth day. And so God now creates a natural process to continue this daylight-night cycle that He had begun on day one. And it's evident that all of this was made with the idea in mind, in this passage, of being or having an effect upon the earth and upon that special creation that God would make. That these would now be used, well, for signs. They would speak for God, if nothing else. What did the psalmist say in Psalm 19? The heavens declare the glory of God. They would speak. They would be as a sign of God's presence and God's creative power. The vastness of the universe speaks to the size of God. For signs, for seasons. They would certainly affect the earth in that way in terms of seasons. And then, of course, for marking the days and years. What had been before in some unspecified way, marking days now would be marked by the lights that God made. It's not troubling, to me at least, that God says He made a lesser light to rule the night. Don't you know that the moon does not generate light? Yeah, I do. I think the Lord knew that too. You ever heard somebody say, look at the moonlight? He's not trying to be scientific here or be technical here, but when I look up in the sky at night, I see the light of the moon. Where that light comes from is not under consideration here. What I think to be more significant is that when you read pagan sources, the difference between Genesis and reading the myths of the pagans is that to the pagan, the moon was a god, and the sun was a god, and the stars are gods. We've all seen the zodiac, haven't we? But no, in Genesis, they're made by God. That's a big difference. And so it's not just like another creation myth. This story makes more sense than anything that I've ever been exposed to in terms of the origin of the universe. Okay, our time is up this morning. Thank you for your patience. Thank you for not laughing at me when I said we were going to cover 2 chapters.